What is your research or your chapter? You've done lots of research on group processes and social identity, but your chapter on the book was on conspiracy theories. What do you think what do you see as the sort of key point that emerges from your chapter and your work in this area that's relevant to COVID-19?
In the chapter, we spoke about three things that were most relevant. One of the key points I wanted to make is that often we tend to think of people who believe in conspiracy theories as people who have got some kind of cognitive deficit, that they're not smart enough to be able to follow the facts or to get exposure to the facts. I think one of the key points I was trying to make is that the research suggests that one of the biggest predictors is that people who are prepared to believe conspiracy theories often have low social identification, so that they feel marginalized from the political system, they have low levels of trust in their community, they're more likely to self-identify as outsiders or minority members within their community. The other thing we highlighted was the intergroup nature of conspiracy theories, that often they're part of some kind of us versus them dynamic, and that myths and misinformation have become weaponized to be able to prosecute these intergroup battles. And the last point I was trying to make is that it's very difficult to defeat them with just information, that we're arguing that you have to address the underlying symptoms, which is the feelings of marginalization and mistrust.
Yeah, and I think those are all great points. And the question the second follow-up question really is, we wrote the book quite a while ago now, and do you think that those issues have become more or less relevant over the course of the pandemic?
I think that they've become somewhat more relevant. The endorsement of conspiracy theories around COVID have remained stubbornly high. So there's a significant minority of people who are prepared to believe conspiracy theories around COVID. And I'd say those numbers are probably pretty similar now than they were back in March and April, when it first started to become a major issue. Why I think it's more relevant now than ever is because, of course, we've invested so much hope and faith in a vaccine to try and get the world back on its feet. There's a lot of evidence that the language of conspiracy theorizing has infiltrated the discussion about vaccination, that people who believe conspiracy theories around COVID are far less likely to intend to vaccinate. And we need to get 70 or 80% of the population to take one of these vaccines once it's developed. So the conspiracy theorizing seems to be a threat to that public health issue.
Yeah, that's great. And just maybe just the last question then, is a bit like again, we wrote the chapter a while ago, many months now. How do you think it's aged, and what would you, if you were writing it again now, what might you change, or what would you like underline perhaps?
Well, I actually think that a lot of the stuff we raised has been borne out. I mean, when we wrote this paper back in March, April, it was in the early days of the suggestion was that it was starting to go down partisan lines, ideological lines. And I think that has become an entrenched part of this, that conservatives are much more likely to use the language of conspiracies when they're talking about COVID. And it's become part of that partisan battle. And that's particularly the case, I think it's fair to say, in America and Spain and Brazil and some other countries.
Yeah.
The other thing that's been borne out, I think, by the data, there was a paper that came out quite recently, just about 10 days ago, and it was looking at people's willingness to believe conspiracy theories around COVID. And one of the biggest predictors, in fact, I think the biggest predictor, was the extent to which people self-identify as a minority within that country. And that could be construed in any way, but that really underscored that point we were making about marginalization appearing to be a key factor in driving conspiracy theories around COVID.
Thanks, Matt. That was really good. And I think I completely agree. Was there anything Nick or Frank wanted to raise just in that context? We can come back to that later, but did you have any thoughts?
Well, I think it's interesting, Matt, that even more recent research underscores that point of the minorities, particularly being prone to, or at least more interested in, these conspiracy theories. And I think that fits with our intuition, right? That the things we see around us, the way we talk to people, we see this often, that the conspiracy theories around 5G and so forth, we might laugh it off as crazy thoughts, but there is actually a pattern here, right? With minorities feeling that this is something they latch onto, perhaps in a sense of empowerment as well, right?
Sure.
Interesting.
That's
Yeah.
right. And just to be clear, in the research, people self-identified as minorities. So we don't know on what basis they were doing that. It could have been around race, it could have been around gender, it could easily have been around political orientation, but it's a very strong effect.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, Matt. I'll turn to you next, Nik, and I'll ask you these same three questions. What, if you look at your chapter, you know, what do you think are the key points that emerge from it that are relevant, and the science behind it that are relevant to the pandemic?
Yeah. So in that chapter that that we wrote, it really focused on issues around compliance or adherence, if you like, and followership, and the ways in which this is structured in quite profound ways by social group memberships. So there are lots of various explanations about what are those factors that drive compliance or adherence, if you like, and also followership. And very often they are probably around, you know, around individual characteristics that some are probably like just followers, others, you know, aren't really. But here, what you try to bring together is very much just all the research that we know that has been conducted over the last few decades that really try to understand more the social, you know, environment and the impact of the social environment, and that, you know, on people's compliance and followership. And in this, we try to really highlight three key factors. One is that very often, you know, those issues around compliance or, again, adherence, I use them interchangeably here, are influenced in powerful ways by collective concerns. So it's not just individuals' concerns for themselves, but very often they play out in social groups. They are concerned with other people in their social groups. And those are really powerful factors that then shape people's compliance, whether people comply or not. Another one that we also looked at was the issues around norms. And norms, I think this is a lot of evidence from COVID that has come out, that still continues to come out, that speaks to issues around norms and how norms influence people's behavior. There's a lot of evidence from other kind of domains around how norms influence compliance. And so there's very strong reason, at least, to believe that also norms would have a very powerful influence on compliance during COVID as well. And the last factor was around leaders, and particular trust in authorities and the leaders that represent those authorities, that then are one of the determinants that impacts whether people follow those leaders, adhere to the policies that they give out and initiate, but also that potential leaders can also derail people from healthy acts, you know, of compliance and followership. And again, there are plenty of examples from that from COVID as well, how it has probably gone in either way, in more healthy way, but also in more unhealthy ways.
And again, thanks, Nik. Yeah, so do you think that those themes and those issues, do you think those have become like more relevant as the pandemic have gone on, or they've just stayed as relevant, or they've become less relevant? What's your general sense of the direction of travel there?
I mean, first I would have thought, and it's probably my thing, that is probably as relevant now as they used to be, because what we really try to do is, shed light on general processes, and they should apply as much then as they do now, as they do in the future. But I think also what Matthew said too, one might actually say potentially that they might have become even more relevant now as the pandemic continues to grow. Cases are still growing around the world in an absolute way, but also as we have more and more second waves, here in Australia, in Melbourne, in many European countries and elsewhere, that actually makes issues around compliance and adherence potentially even more important. So, and particularly now, because the second wave, many people feel that it's even more of a sacrifice to go along with it, that actually really highlights the importance of compliance and adherence in those contexts.
And is there anything that you would like change if you were to write the chapter again now, do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe not change, I think but certainly what I find interesting, similar to what Matthew said too, is that there's a lot of research and evidence that has come out since we wrote the book. There's one study that has just come out also like a few weeks ago, which you may have seen, that looks at national identification and compliance, big study across 67 nations, that found the stronger people identified with the nation that they are part of, the more likely they were to go along with, the government regulations and trying to, protect the public from further infection. And that's very powerful data which we didn't have at the time. We mainly worked with claims and evidence that we could extract from other kind of contexts. But I think there's lots of more examples, I think, and also more scientific evidence that speaks to some of the points we look at.
Yeah, I think that's right too. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. So again, basically the weight of evidence has come behind the analysis. I think that's correct. Yeah. So yeah, Frank. Yeah. So you probably got a sense of what the questions are going to be now. But let's. What do you think were the main kind of points that emerge from your chapter that help us to understand, the nature of responses to the pandemic?
I think I'm probably going to focus on one only, which is so fundamental that it's probably worth focusing on that. The idea was very much to get across this idea that there's two ways of thinking about psychology, of course. One, which is a very individualized idea of, which manifests in the book as the frailty model of looking at the individuals, how individuals act, and viewing groups and society as a collection of individuals, as opposed to understanding behavior and attitudes and voter attitudes, for example, or attitudes towards the COVID crisis as a collective phenomenon, right? And in public policy, which is my terrain, we see actually since the 1950s, we see the pendulum going in between. It moves from one to the other, and it struggles to find a kind of good medium. So for example, in the 1950s, we have the behavioral revolution with this hype of individual psychology. Then we have social constructivism, social identity theory, new institutionalism, drawing attention to group life and how that needs to be at the forefront of analysis. And then we have rational choice, public choice, going back to individual. We go back to yet again a round of looking at the group level. And so in a time that COVID struck was actually a moment that the pendulum was back again at the individual level, where people doing public policy work, particularly in North America, viewed humans once again as individuals with cognitive shortcuts, easily overloaded. So the frailty model that we've critiqued in the book was actually a manifestation of a broader climate, I think, of thinking in political science, public policy, of once again viewing individuals as cognitive misers, prone to errors, needing all sorts of paternalistic interventions. And the book was an opportunity to say, let's go back to what we've forgotten once again. Human behavior is largely driven by social identity and group life, right? And the chapter was very much about getting the pendulum once again where it needs to be, because if you think about interventions, well, whether that's in health or in other domains, and you have a frailty model in mind or a individualized understanding of psychology, you miss the social, and that's exactly where the action is, right? So in order to get behavior change, you need to appeal to people as members of groups. Of course, these are the points that you and Steve Reicher and many others have made much better than I could. But the challenge was very much to get attention back on the group dynamics, right? This is not to say that individual psychology doesn't matter or that people don't take cognitive shortcuts and so forth. But if, as a policymaker, if you design policy based on an individualized understanding of human psychology, you may not get a lot of impact, right? So the challenge was very much for the COVID professionals and the policymakers to once again view humans as social beings, and best therefore to design appeals for behavioral change with that model in mind. That was kind of the mission I thought we had in the chapter. Yeah.
Well, I think that's one. I think that's right. And do you think that those issues have remained? I mean, I think it's very clear they were very important early on. You see in some countries where, that debate was played out. There was that, as you say in the chapter, was that discussion about, the idea of whether or not people had the stomach for, some controls on their behavior and lockdowns and things like that, or that they would just they'd get fatigue early on, that type of idea. And so in some countries that you talk about, Britain, Netherlands, the fatigue kind of model triumphed. Do you think that battle has been kind of fought, or do you still think that the debate, the two models, the collective strength versus the individualized frailty, do you think that is still a useful lens for looking at the way people are tackling and thinking about and approaching the pandemic?
Yeah, most definitely, because I think the evidence that Yolanda, for example, found with her research, that actually the idea of the frailty model of fatigue kicking in, there's actually very little evidence for that, if I understand it correctly, right? That's, to me, fascinating, right? The idea that we've so relied on the frailty model that we might have underestimated the extent to which people are willing to make sacrifices on behalf of the group, right? And particularly, and this goes, of course, to Nik's chapter on leadership, if you have a leader who actually constantly talks about the crisis as this is a matter of us, collectively we can do this, right? If that's constantly reiterated by the leaders in a consistent way, without weird outliers as we've seen them in the United Kingdom, there's a good chance that people will continue to comply, because it's seen as a collective endeavor, a collective challenge, and something that people can put their weight behind, right? So I think that's, I would not necessarily change anything about the chapter, but the evidence now is, of course, there that this social angle is so incredibly important, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think just as an interject there, as an observation, and I don't know what the others think, but you know, in my interactions with journalists, which have been many, they always want to tell a story about frailty, and they say, are people cracking now? And you say, well, actually not. And then a month later, no, are they cracking now? And you look at Victoria, where they say, are they cracking now? No, they're still strong, you know, but they still want they still want to write the story about frailty. So. And actually, as you say, Landa's data, other data sets are saying, actually, you know, the story is one of enduring compliance. And as long as you can justify the interventions and the activities and the actions that you're promoting, leaders promoting, the evidence is that people are still willing to, you know, make the hard yards and make the hard, you know, behavioral choices, and that they need to secure positive outcomes for the collective. I'm just interested in a way in why do you think that frailty narrative, or the desire to write that frailty narrative, remains strong? Because my observation is there's still a lot of people wanting to put that out there, and however much evidence you put in there, you can show them, well, you know, Australians, they've had higher levels of solidarity now than they've had in any survey for the last sort of 10 years. So the idea they're cracking up doesn't stack up. Why do you think that there's this ongoing desire to talk about frailty when actually that isn't the big story?
I think in my domain, in political science, public administration, public policy, it's, to me, my hunch is that this is because the background climate is very much one of behavioral insights, nudging, which, right, if you randomize controlled trials and statistical evidence is put on a pedestal or is declared the holy grail now, right? And that's all generated with very individualistic kind of theories. And once again, it's not about saying that that's not valuable in its own right, right? But it needs to be embedded in a more social understanding of human behavior. But because no one is actually making those arguments anymore, at least in political science and public administration, where it's an uphill battle, quite literally, right? That if you don't do behavioral insights, right, then you're sort of an outlier and people think you're a bit of a niche. But it's actually the niche here that has a lot more to offer.
Yeah. Well, I think that's so. So I think that, again, what's interesting about this conversation, I think, you know, firstly, I think, you know, actually there's a lot of consistency. The points are obviously all aligned. I think you're all saying, look, you know, basically the evidence that's come out subsequently has reinforced the points rather than undermined them. And actually, if you were writing a book today, you just have more data to work with, and the case would be stronger, perhaps, which I think is, I would absolutely agree with that. So the last question I'd like everyone to reflect on is, like, why maybe has the book not had more influence, or these arguments have not had more influence than we might, you know, than it has had? I mean, I think there has been, in some places it has had a bit. I think Steve, writer in the UK's, had quite a lot of success in putting those ideas out there, but I still don't get a sense that they're in any sense the dominant way of thinking about these issues. Or am I wrong? I mean, I'm just kind of interested in those meta reflections, what people are seeing there.
I'm not sure if it's easy for me to get a sense of the zeitgeist about how much of an impact these ideas have had, but I would say that, a little bit like what Frank was saying, that people default to individualistic explanations of behavior, and it's just very difficult to shake that. But the other thing, I mean, just responding to your question before, Alex, is that the media are addicted to frailty stories and to drama and to negativity. And so one thing that's really distressed me a little bit is their eagerness to imply that people are violating social distancing rules, etc., often using tricked up photographs, basically underselling the extent to which people are complying with the COVID regulations. And just picking up on Nik's point, we know how strong norms are and how destructive that sort of misinformation can be.
Yeah, and I think that, again, we were making that point, 4 or 5 months ago, that in, as you say, in Nik's chapter. Yeah, no, I agree. Did you have any, I think there's, the other bit there too is I think there's an ideological thing here, as well. My sense is, there are some, I think if, and that, when we're talking about group memberships, there are those group memberships also have values associated with them. And I think, that there are, some dominant groups for whom individualism isn't just an analytical tool, it's a political one as well. And I think, people are scared of collectives, and they're scared of collectives, that might bring about change. And I think one of the things about the pandemic is it's actually shown that change is possible. And the idea that you might come out of this with a real appetite for changing other things in society, I think that might, particularly people who've got vested interests aligned with the status quo, I think there could be some nervousness around that, and they're keen to hold your horses. Hang on a minute, no, we're not going to reset here. I think there's some action in that space, but again, not a lot of joining of the dots on what work is the analysis doing here and what's really motivating it. Did you have any thoughts on that, Nik? Were there any things again related to your stuff? Yeah.
The thing that was on my mind was I was when also to read through the points that Frank made and also Matthew, I thought too actually the role of the media is a very and the biased nature of the reporting, I think, is a big part of the picture overall. And I think that is, I think that has a lot to do with, the common narratives. It's just that it's a very one-dimensional presentation of negative stories, because it is not a very good story to say that, groups are strong and things are working well. That just doesn't make a very good, story. So I think that is a big part. And the other thing is, so I also can't really assess, I think, the overall impact, how impactful was the book versus, I think it's hard to assess really. So I can't really, at least I wouldn't be able to comment on that. But I think another one is why is maybe, this analysis why has this analysis not been stronger compared to other kind of theories within psychology of how humans work? But the other question maybe is also, why hasn't it maybe been more impactful compared to other fields of science? And I think there I would only say, if you look at medical science, and I think it probably still has to do with also a bit ideology, false perceptions of the status of the science, where we just think, other fields of science, medicine and epidemiology is somewhat more of a high status, science or psychology, and those analyses don't get as much publicity as they deserve. That's maybe the other point I would make.
Yeah, and I think, and I know Steve talks about that a lot too. I think the idea that, actually, I think if I could change one thing in the book, I think we said, that, look, until we get a vaccine, all that we can do is deal with human behavior. So let's get on and understand that. And I think the point that Matthew raised, actually now there's so many, there's quite a lot of, conspiratorial ideation around what a vaccine is and so on, that even if there were a vaccine available, all the things that we talk about in the chapters are really relevant to getting people to take it and to, and more generally to engage with the, best medical practice. So actually, I think, the one-eyed focus, as you're saying, Nik, on just the medical science epidemiology, which I think has been a backdrop to the whole thing, I think has been, very unfortunate.
Yeah.
And I think when people come to reflect back on this period of history, I think, I'm happy at this point that the book stands as a record of where the science was and where it needed to be. And these questions will be about why we didn't invest more in understanding the implications, for policy, for practice, and for research more generally. I think those questions will still remain to be answered. So, and hopefully this discussion will be a resource to help people when they're doing sense making in the future, but also hopefully students and other people trying to make sense of, the challenges that lie ahead.